Hey there! Is today your first time here? Or maybe your first time in a while? If so, maybe you're wondering exactly who we are and what this church is all about. Well, we'd like you to know that we're a group of ordinary people who are on an amazing journey together, following Christ. Our guide is the Bible because it's the divinely inspired Word of God, and it will never take us in the wrong direction. Along the way, we hope you'll see that we are welcoming and spiritually passionate, and that getting to know you is a big deal to us. We know that the road is rough sometimes, but we work really hard to bring you practical and relevant messages to equip and encourage you through life's ups and downs. We want you to know that we care about this community, and we believe that it's our job to make it a better place. So, no matter who you are or where you've been, we're glad you're here with us today, and we hope that you'll join us on our journey, following Christ and living out His plan for us. So, welcome to church.
Welcome to St. Luke's United Methodist Church. We are excited you're here to worship with us today. Please take the red folders and fill out as much information as you're comfortable with. This gives us a way to get in touch with you and give you more information about all the great activities going on here at St. Luke's.
The Administrative Council is currently looking at a new way of doing church leadership called the Single Board Model. We invite you to join us February 10th at 2 p.m. to be part of the conversation. We will be discussing what the single board model looks like, as well as how it would work best at St. Luke's. We really hope you'll find the time to come join in and be a part of this conversation.
On February 23rd and 24th, we will have our first ever mission weekend here at St. Luke's. On Saturday, we will have several opportunities for you to serve in the community, and we will meet here at the church at 8:30 for donuts, and then work on our projects from 9 till noon. On Sunday, we will celebrate all of the missions we did at St. Luke's during worship, and then have a luncheon where you can learn more about how to get involved. If you're interested in serving or want more information, please contact Jennifer in the church office.
Today is the day Financial Peace University comes to St. Luke's. We'll kick off the program at 6 o'clock in the Family Center. If you still haven't made up your mind, then come to the first 3 lessons. I'll see you then.
What would happen if the people of God started handling money God's ways? You work too hard to get to the end of your life and have nothing to show for it.
This is my family's legacy that I'm talking about here. I've got to have a plan to be focused.
That knowledge that you pass down to your kids, that is how you change a family tree.
You change your life when you get sick and tired of being sick and tired. And you have that moment where you say, I had it. I'm not going to live like this anymore.
All right, it's going to be a great morning this day. Let's stand up and let's sing together and let's sing God's name, because that's what we do when we come together and open up the heaven.
Waiting for this day, we gathered in your name, calling out to you. We're glory like a fire, awakening desire will burn our hearts with you. You're the reason we're here. You're the reason we're singing. Open up the heavens, we want to see you. Open up the floodgates, Almighty.
All right, let's take a moment and let's greet each other in God's name. Let's sing again. This is fun. Let's sing again. Here we go. without grumbling. Each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others, as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms. All of us.
And every day he would go look at his treasure and he was so so excited about it, right? Every day he went back and he went back and he went back and he just kept that treasure all to himself, just buried there, and he didn't do anything with it. Until one day, guess what? Somebody came by and saw his treasure that he was doing, and they stole it. And he came back and the hole was there and there was no treasure. And he was so devastated because everything he had was there and it was gone. And the lady walked by and she's like, what's the matter? And he told her what happened. And she said, well, if you weren't doing anything with your treasures, then all you have to do is put a rock there and bury the rock. And it would be no difference, right? The rock and the gold. Because he never used it and he never did anything with it to show God's love, did he? So God tells us in the Bible that we have amazing gifts. You know, both of you, God gave you like all these gifts and talents. But unlike that guy, we need to use them, right? Because God tells us that we need to use our gifts to serve others. Peter told us that in the verse that he just read. Peter was writing to a group of people and they were kind of sad and they were having a bad time. So Peter said, no matter what's going on, we should use our gifts and talents that God gave us to serve other people, right, and help. So you have to think of ways to, no matter what your gift is, if you like to draw, you could draw a picture and take it to the nursing home, right, like they did that Wednesday. Or if you love to smile, both of y'all have beautiful smiles, you can go around school smiling at everybody, right, and bring them joy and happiness. So no matter what you do, show God that your gifts and show Him for His glory, right? Can y'all pray with me, please? Dear God, thank you for all of our gifts. And we pray that we can use them to glorify your holy name. In your name, amen. Thank you.
As we come to our time of prayer, I'd like to remind you, if you're looking for a joys and concern list with all of our joys and concerns, you can find them at either the visitor center or at the shelf as you leave the sanctuary this way. One concern I'd like to lift up that came in late at the end of this week, if you'll remember Misty Sherman's dad, he has been in the hospital and not doing very well, but he's taking a little bit of a turn this weekend. So if you will remember him, Misty is on her way there this morning, so keep her in your prayers as well. But now I invite you to pray with me. God, this morning we come into your house looking for your Spirit, God. We come in knowing everything that we've been through, God, knowing everything we have on our schedule, on our calendar. We come in full of concerns and worries, full of health issues. God, we come in full of excitement, full of blessings, full of everything that you've poured out in your life. And so this morning, we come before you knowing one thing for certain, and that is that as we come into this place, God, as we lift our voices up to you, you hear our prayers. God, you hear the words that we speak. You hear the words that we can't even form. God, we ask that you help to quiet the busyness, the hecticness, the noise that so easily invades into our lives, so that, God, as we're here, as we're present in this place, we are able to feel you. We're able to hear your voice. God, we're able to let your words sink into our lives so that we are transformed. So that, God, as we leave this place, as we go beyond these walls, we go out being your hands and feet. The love and the joy, the hope, the peace, the healing that you pour out in our lives, God, we now take out into the world. We take hope, joy, and peace wherever we might go. God, we pray this prayer using the one that your Son taught us. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, passage you read all of a sudden meant something else? This week, as I was starting to prepare for my sermon planning a couple of weeks ago, I kept reading the passage from 1 Peter, and I want to read it to you again. You heard it just a moment ago. It says, "Be hospitable to one another without complaining. Like good stewards of the manifold grace of God, serve one another with whatever gifts each of you has received." So that passage had been sticking with me for a couple of weeks, thinking of this idea of, like good stewards, use the gifts that God has given you. This week has been a very hectic and busy week. I realize I say that just about most weeks because I think the world we live in, they all are. But after church last Sunday, we had communion for the shut-ins, and that was a great experience. I was here, I was able to pray, and then the week started in earnest. I left right after that to fly out to a conference in Los Angeles. And it was a wonderful experience. I was there with 20 pastors who I've had the privilege of serving with for 3 years. And this passage from 1 Peter jumped to light. This idea of using the gifts that we have. We were in Los Angeles to talk about creative communication. And it started off on the first day at a place called Homeboy Industries, started 30 years ago by a Catholic priest. And he's there to rehab gang members, to help some of the most hardest hit areas, to help some of the people who have got the least amount of hope see that there is a reason to live. It was fascinating watching this white 60-year-old priest talking to gang members who had been shot, who had been murderers, and speak to them about hope, using the gifts that he had been given. The next day, we went to First United Methodist Church in Los Angeles, and it was a church that had been in decline, and they eventually got to the point where they could no longer sustain a building, so all they own now is a parking lot. They own a parking lot in downtown Los Angeles, and they can worship in that parking lot on Sunday morning. It's creative. On mornings like this, I'm grateful that's not where we're at. It'd be kind of cold. But the pastor there is still using her gifts and her graces to be able to witness to the community she's in. We then went to this area called Skid Row, which is where all of the homeless in LA are basically quarantined, and to see the people there that are ministering and working and being a part of that, using these gifts that they were given. The next day we met with an Imagineer, one of the people who helped to design Disneyland. And he talked about how he's using those very skills to tell stories at churches about using creative spaces. It was fascinating looking at all of these different experiences and how Peter calls us to use the gifts that we've been given. And how they lived out that faithfulness in various different ways, the same way we do. We have, each and every one of us gathered here, these different gifts that God has given us. And as Peter writes this letter, he's urging us to use them. Don't let them just sit on the shelf and waste away. Don't be like the man that buries the treasure and it doesn't matter. But Peter is urging, take these gifts that you have that are very different. Right? The course of this week showed me 3 very fruitful ministries, all done in different ways. Take the gifts you have and use them. So I kept coming back to this passage. And then it was late Thursday night, and I'm sitting in LAX with 3 other pastors, and we're sitting there, and as I go to reread this passage, something else strikes me. You see, it was a great week of being able to see these ministries, but it was also a week that was crammed full and busy. And so 4 of us pastors are sitting in an airport trying to write our sermons because there was no other time during that week. So I'm sitting in LAX trying to write a sermon about Sabbath because I couldn't find any other time. And as I read this passage from Peter, the word that stuck out that had never seemed to matter before, the word that jumped out to me is this word steward, right? Because that is the important word that kind of links everything. Peter says, be good stewards of the manifold grace that God has given you. Use that to serve one another. Be a good steward of the gifts you were given. And as I'm sitting in an airport writing a sermon about Sabbath, that word steward immediately convicted me of the week I had. Last week we started talking about what is it like to live a life of faithfulness in a world that never stops. Our lives are busy, they are hectic, they are chaotic. If it's not scheduled, then it's the unplanned that gets us. There is always stuff going on, and most of us will tell you we are using the gifts we have been given as best we can. We are living out what Peter says. We're taking those gifts and we are being faithful in the world. But what happens when we get caught up in these gifts? What happens when all of a sudden we find ourselves running at that 24/7 pace and we realize we're not doing everything we should to be faithful? You see, that word steward is important. It's got a couple of connotations. The first is that you are taking care of someone else's property. That's what a steward is. It's someone who is managing someone else's property. So if you are the steward of these gifts, what Peter is telling you is not only are you managing the gifts you've been given, but they're never your gifts, right? These are the gifts that God has given you. How are you managing them? And that's the second part. Are you being a good steward? Are you using those resources in a way that lives up to the faithful calling? So I want to jump to another story in the Gospels. It's a story in the Gospel of Luke. It's chapter 10, verses 38 through 42. Now as they went on their way, he entered a certain village, where a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. She had a sister named Mary who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to what he was saying. But Martha was distracted by her many tasks. So she came to him and asked, "Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do all the work by myself? Tell her then to help me." But the Lord answered her, "Martha, Martha, you are worried and distracted by many things. There is need of only one thing. Mary has chosen the better part, which will not be taken away from her." Jesus is out traveling and he comes across this town, and there's a lot of speculation if Jesus knew this Mary and Martha or if it was a different one. What matters though is that he comes to this house unexpected. And it's Martha's house, and so he comes up to it, and Martha says, "Hey, you can stay here." But with that comes a whole host of problems. She wasn't expecting Jesus, and they know who Jesus is, right? If you are inviting a VIP into your house, you understand Martha's fear and concern. Your house is not the way it should be. And so Martha immediately begins working to pick up the house. There are things you have to do with hospitality, with it just being your house. So she starts cleaning up. She picks up. She's trying to tidy up, moving from room to room before Jesus gets in there and making sure the magazines are straight and the toys are out of the way. And she's trying to make sure dinner is getting prepared and that the bathroom is clean. She's trying to do all of these various things. It's hospitable. It's important. It's what matters. She's trying to use the gifts that God has given her, what Peter talks about, and get everything prepared and ready and presentable. We understand that. We understand what it's like, even if it's not getting your house ready. It's keeping your life in order, running from one thing to the next, because we have to. Right? If we're going to be faithful stewards of our gifts, then we have to stay busy engaging in these gifts that we've been given. We go from early in the morning to late at night, stopping long enough to maybe get enough sleep to be well rested. And it doesn't matter what age you are. We're all busy just with different things. So Martha is banging away in the kitchen trying to get the food ready, and Mary does something completely different. Jesus sits down, and Mary goes, and he sits down right next to her. She starts talking to him. And Jesus begins conversing. And Martha has probably been running around quickly and just now realized that she's doing it by herself. So I can imagine some of the passive aggressiveness going on, right? Martha is in the kitchen and she knows Mary's not there. So you start hearing the pots and pans banging just a little bit louder. You start hearing the grumbling and you say, "What'd you say, Martha?" "Oh, nothing, right?" Like you can feel the tension kind of building, because finally it comes to this point where Martha is put out and perturbed. The words of 1 Peter kind of ringing in our heads as we hear that she's using the gifts she has to serve, and she says, "Jesus, come on. This is ridiculous. We could be done in half the time if Mary would get up and come help." How many times have we been in that same spot? If someone would just come help, if they would use the gifts they've got, my life would be easier. And Jesus looks at Martha and he says, "Martha, you've missed the point. Right? You've missed the point completely." And he said, "Mary has chose this better way, and I'm not going to take that away from her." Now, at this moment, you've got to believe that Martha is standing there dumbfounded. Right? She doesn't quite know what to do with that. What would you do with that? If in the middle of your busy day, where if you remove one little thing, everything crumbles down, when you're running around like a chicken with your head cut off, when you're exhausted and tired, how would you feel if Jesus point blank looked at you and said, "The person sitting down over there has chosen the better way"? What would you do? How would you respond? What would be going on in your head? You see, so many times we link this passage to busyness. And we say it was Martha's busyness that got her in trouble, and it was Mary's willingness to stop. But if you dive in deeper, you realize Jesus is speaking to something significantly more than just busyness, right? Because it wasn't Martha just being busy for the sake of being busy. Martha was doing what needed to be done, at least in her head. She wouldn't say any of that was idle work. But Jesus is driving to a much deeper point. It's kind of echoing that idea of being a steward of what you've been given and jumping back to one of our commandments. It's this idea of Sabbath and what Sabbath truly should be. Right? One of our 10 commandments. Honor the Sabbath and keep it holy. Now we know that. You've heard it from since you were a child. If you grew up in church, there was probably a poster in some Sunday school classroom you went to that looked like it was on this stone tablet, and it had it etched out, and it had those words. We know them, but if we're being honest with ourselves, how many of you actually keep Sabbath? When we talk about living in a world that is always open, that runs 24/7, that never seems to stop, how many of you are good at actually stopping? Kind of pulling some of those cards away and being like Mary and sitting down and stopping. Sabbath is not just meant as a day of doing nothing, which is a lot of times what we equate it to. We equate it to this idea that on the Sabbath day you're supposed to sit around and do nothing. That's the point, right? We call it a day of rest. And how could we possibly get rest? But Sabbath goes deeper. There's a reason that it's talked about in Exodus so much. There's a reason that Sabbath is pushed so hard. It's not just a day about doing nothing. Sabbath is a day in which you don't do anything because you are relying upon the gifts that God has given you. You see, at its heart, Sabbath is not meant to be a day where you just sit in a chair and do absolutely nothing. It is meant to be a day in which you recharge and you rest in the care of God. See, there's a big difference between watching a football game in your lazy boy and actually spending time letting God recharge and refill you when life is not hectic and busy. It's the difference between Martha having to do what needed to be done and Mary being willing to sit and to listen. To let Jesus speak into her life in that moment. See, one of the things we miss in this hectic, crazy world we live in is when our schedules get tighter and tighter, our time to sit with God gets smaller Sabbath time goes away. And we tell ourselves there's no possible way. So as I'm sitting in this airport watching the world fly by, I jump back to the very beginning, to Genesis. And if you remember those words, you remember the words talking about God taking and God forming. And the short version is God takes and forms everything. Me, you, all of the people, all of the plants, all of the animals, the earth, the water, gravity, everything. In 6 days, God does it. This God that can create, this God that is endless, this God that is limitless. And then what does God do on the seventh day? God rests. God rests. God manages to find time in God's busy schedule of creation to actually take a break. What those words should tell you is that if God, the Creator, the Sustainer, can manage to take a rest, then I bet you can too. You don't have to be the one responsible for holding up that card pyramid. You don't have to be the one responsible, like Martha was, for running around and doing everything. A part of being a good and a faithful steward means there is time to use your gift, and there is time to let it just rest. There is time to be active, and there is a time to listen. As I was looking up passages on Sabbath, I came across one in Exodus that I had never read before. It's Exodus 31:14. And it says all the typical stuff about Sabbath. It says, take the Sabbath, honor the Sabbath. But then there's this one little line that kind of struck me. It said, if you do not honor the Sabbath, you will be put to death. It's pretty harsh. Pretty hard word right there. If you do not honor the Sabbath, you will be put to death. And as I thought about it more and more, I realized there is nobody today that's going to come up and kill you if you don't keep the Sabbath. It's just not going to happen. Most people are too busy to realize you're not doing it. But then I thought about it even more. What are you doing to yourself when you don't keep the Sabbath? How is it that you are slowly cutting away parts of your life when you feel you are so busy you cannot stop? Granted, no one else will ever put you to death for not honoring the Sabbath. But what are you doing to your very life when you are never stopping to let yourself refill and recharge with God? I sat at an airport highly convicted because I knew full well I was going to preach words on Sunday that I'm awful at. I'm not good with. I don't sit well. I don't go slow well. I like the way Martha works. But yet if we want to talk about faithfulness, we have to talk about being present with God. My honest answer is I don't know what that looks like in your life. I don't know if it looks like Sunday morning or Tuesday evening. I don't know if it looks like 30 to 45 minutes on a lunch break somewhere randomly during the week. I don't know what it is. But I can tell you that 1 Peter urges us to be good stewards of our gift, to take what God has given us and to use it well. And if at times that means not doing it, then so be it. Mary teaches us that the better thing is to sit and to rest and to be present with God. And God's very example is one of taking that time to recover. So I encourage you, as you leave here this week, as you go out into the hecticness, the busyness, the world that is always open and always functioning, find that time somewhere. Find that time to rest and recharge, to listen to God, and to see where God's leading you from there. In an always open world, find some time to be at peace and to sit with God. Let us pray. This morning we are grateful for a time to come in and to simply listen. To be able to sit and to let your word sink in. To know that it is the Sabbath rest that sustains us. So God, we ask that here it is easy, but as we go out, it becomes harder. So help us to stay focused on what it is to be faithful, what it is to rest, what it is to find Sabbath in this busy world. It's in your name we pray. Amen. This morning we have heard God's word read. We have lifted up our joys and our concerns. And so I now invite you to give of your tithes and your offerings as the ushers come forward. God, we ask you to take these gifts, to bless them and use them for the building of your kingdom. Amen.
All right, you've heard it once, so let's join together again. I bet that all the people saying it part's pretty easy for you. Here we go.
You are not alone if you are lonely. When you feel afraid, you're not the only. We are all the same, in need of mercy, to be forgiven
God that has called us in here, the God that has given us our gifts, calls us forth to use them and to find our rest in Him. All God's people said, Amen. Amen.